If you love your son, the doctor said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the screen, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this baby may not be his. Margaret Whitmore felt the air leave her lungs as she sat in the dim ultrasound room, the soft hum of the machine suddenly sounding louder than it should have. Her hands folded neatly over her leather handbag, as if posture alone could hold her world together. Just moments earlier, she had been smiling at the grainy black and white image on the monitor, imagining a crib in the spare bedroom of her two-story home in Naperville, picturing herself rocking her first grandchild while snow fell softly outside in the Illinois winter. At 67 years old, Margaret had buried a husband, raised a son, and built a modest but comfortable life through discipline and sacrifice, and this baby felt like a reward for decades of quiet endurance. Emily, her 32-year-old daughter-in-law, had been glowing in the waiting room, one hand resting gently over her 12-week belly, chatting about paint colors for the nursery and the rising price of diapers as if the future were already settled and secure. Daniel, Margaret's only child, had been at work that morning, trusting his mother to accompany his wife to the appointment because that was the kind of family they were, or at least the kind Margaret believed they were. When the technician stepped out to retrieve the doctor, nothing seemed unusual. Pregnancies required measurements, confirmations, timelines. But when the doctor entered, his expression was not celebratory. He studied the screen longer than expected, asked a few precise questions about dates, and then requested to speak with Margaret alone under the gentle pretense of reviewing paperwork. Now, seated beside her in the small consultation area, he kept his tone professional yet unmistakably concerned. He explained that according to the fetal measurements, the gestational age did not align with the timeline Emily had reported, that the discrepancy was not a matter of days but weeks, and that in his experience such inconsistencies often carried consequences beyond medicine. Margaret straightened her spine, her first instinct to defend her family, to insist there must be an error, that machines were imperfect and stress could alter recollection. She had always believed in loyalty above all else. She had taught Daniel that marriage was a commitment measured not in convenience, but in character. The doctor did not accuse, did not speculate recklessly, but his final words lingered in the sterile air between them. If this were his family, he would advise verifying the facts before celebrating too soon. Margaret nodded politely, thanked him for his diligence, and rose with controlled composure. Yet inside her a quiet tremor had begun. As she walked back toward the waiting room, where Emily scrolled through her phone, smiling at something on the screen, Margaret realized that the future she had pictured, holiday dinners, first birthdays, college funds carefully planned down to the dollar, now rested on a question she had never imagined needing to ask. Margaret walked back into the waiting room with the same steady expression she had practiced for decades at funerals, bank meetings, and parent-teacher conferences, the kind of expression that revealed nothing and invited no questions. Emily looked up immediately, her smile bright and expectant. She asked if everything was fine and whether the doctor had said anything about the baby being healthy. Margaret forced a gentle nod and said that the doctor simply wanted to confirm a few measurements and that everything appeared routine for 12 weeks. The lie tasted unfamiliar in her mouth, but she delivered it calmly, reminding herself that clarity required patience. On the drive home along Interstate 88, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dashboard of her silver sedan, Emily chatted about prenatal vitamins, stroller brands, and how Daniel had already started browsing cribs online that cost more than Margaret had once paid for her first used car. Margaret listened carefully, not to the words themselves but to the details between them. When Emily mentioned the due date again, Margaret noted the exact week. When Emily described the night they had supposedly conceived, Margaret quietly calculated the calendar in her mind. The numbers did not settle comfortably. That evening, Margaret sat alone at her oak dining table, the same table where she had helped Daniel with algebra homework 20 years earlier. She opened her planner and began counting backward from the expected due date, aligning weeks and months with holidays and family events. She remembered that Daniel had been in Denver for a work conference during part of that time frame, a trip that had lasted 5 days and included photographs posted publicly. Margaret did not jump to conclusions, but she had always trusted mathematics more than emotion. She poured herself a glass of water instead of wine, wanting her thoughts clear and replayed the doctor's tone in her mind. He had not sounded dramatic or judgmental. He had sounded careful. Margaret considered calling Daniel immediately, but she stopped herself. Accusations without proof could fracture a family faster than any secret. Instead, she decided to observe. Over the next few days, she paid closer attention during Sunday dinner at her house. Emily avoided direct eye contact when the topic of timelines arose. Daniel appeared enthusiastic yet slightly distracted, as if he were managing more than work deadlines. Margaret noticed small inconsistencies in stories about appointments and subtle corrections in dates that seemed rehearsed. She did not confront anyone. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself more clearly when given space. By the end of the week, Margaret understood one thing with certainty: whether the doctor was mistaken or not, something about this pregnancy was being handled with too much precision and too little transparency. And Margaret Whitmore, who had survived widowhood, mortgage payments, and the quiet loneliness of an empty nest, was not a woman who ignored careful warnings. By the following Tuesday, Margaret had moved from quiet observation to deliberate verification, not out of suspicion but out of responsibility, because she believed that protecting her son required clarity rather than comfort. She began by calling Daniel during his lunch break, keeping her tone warm and casual, asking about his Denver conference from earlier that spring. Daniel spoke easily about the hotel near the convention center, the long meetings, and the evening client dinners that had kept him out past 9 o'clock most nights. Margaret listened carefully and asked him to remind her of the exact week he had traveled, pretending she needed the information to organize family photos on her computer. When he mentioned the dates, her chest tightened slightly, because those 5 days aligned precisely with the window the doctor had quietly indicated. After ending the call, she retrieved the small leather-bound calendar she had kept for years, flipping back to the month in question. Daniel had driven her to a cardiology appointment the day before his flight, and she had written it down. She traced the pen marks slowly, aligning them with the estimated gestational age that had been measured in weeks and days. The discrepancy was no longer abstract. It was measurable. Still, Margaret refused to let imagination outrun evidence. She requested copies of the ultrasound report under the pretense of wanting a keepsake for a baby memory book. The clinic provided the printed summary, including crown to rump length and estimated gestational age calculated in weeks. Margaret sat at her kitchen table once more, calculator beside her planner, converting weeks into calendar dates with careful precision. The numbers did not bend to optimism. According to the medical measurements, conception likely occurred while Daniel was 2 states away. That evening, Emily called Margaret to ask if she could borrow a decorative bassinet that had once belonged to Daniel. Margaret agreed gently and invited her over for coffee. When Emily arrived, her smile seemed practiced, her gestures slightly hurried. Margaret studied her not with hostility, but with steady attention. She noticed how quickly Emily shifted topics whenever timelines surfaced, how confidently she repeated the same phrasing about being exactly 12 weeks along, as though memorized. Margaret asked one simple question about the first positive pregnancy test, and Emily paused for a fraction of a second too long before answering. It was a small hesitation, but Margaret had raised a child. She recognized the sound of someone arranging a story in real time. As Emily left with the bassinet carefully placed in the trunk of her car, Margaret stood on her front porch and watched until the vehicle turned the corner. The quiet suburban street looked unchanged, yet Margaret understood that certainty was no longer optional. If there was truth beneath these inconsistencies, it would surface soon, and when it did, she intended to meet it prepared rather than surprised. Margaret did not sleep much that night, not because she was overwhelmed, but because her mind refused to ignore what the numbers had already suggested. She lay in her quiet bedroom, listening to the steady ticking of the hallway clock, replaying every conversation from the past 3 months. She thought about the day Emily had announced the pregnancy at Sunday dinner, the way Daniel had looked surprised for just a fraction of a second before smiling and pulling his wife close. At the time, Margaret had interpreted it as joyful shock. Now she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The following morning, Margaret made a decision that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. She called her family attorney, a man she had known for over 20 years, and scheduled a discreet consultation. She did not accuse anyone. She simply asked what options existed if paternity ever needed to be legally confirmed. The attorney explained that non-invasive prenatal paternity testing was available through certified laboratories and could be conducted safely with a blood sample from the mother and a cheek swab from the alleged father. Margaret thanked him and ended the call, her hands steady. She was not seeking drama. She was seeking certainty. Later that week, Daniel stopped by her house after work. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his expression carrying the quiet pressure of upcoming responsibility. Margaret offered him coffee and asked gently how he was feeling about becoming a father. Daniel admitted that the news had come faster than expected, but insisted he was ready. There was pride in his voice, but beneath it Margaret detected something fragile, like a structure built too quickly on uncertain ground. She considered telling him everything she knew, but instinct urged patience. Instead, she asked if he would be open to taking a simple medical test for peace of mind, explaining that doctors sometimes recommended additional screenings during pregnancy. Daniel frowned slightly, confused but not defensive. He asked if something was wrong. Margaret chose her words carefully, saying that there had been minor discrepancies in the timeline, and that clarification could protect everyone involved. The room grew quiet. Daniel stared at the kitchen table where he had once done elementary school spelling homework, and Margaret saw the child he used to be layered over the man he had become. He did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. He said he trusted Emily completely, yet he also trusted his mother. That was the fracture Margaret had feared most. She assured him that seeking facts did not mean assuming betrayal. It meant preventing future harm. Daniel agreed to think about it. As he left that evening, Margaret stood at the doorway watching his car disappear down the same suburban street she had watched from decades earlier when he first learned to ride a bicycle. She understood that whatever truth emerged next would not only define a marriage, it would redefine the foundation of her family. Daniel did not take long to call his mother back. 2 days after their quiet conversation in her kitchen, he asked if they could meet again, this time without Emily. Margaret agreed and chose a small coffee shop a few miles from her neighborhood, a neutral place where emotions might stay contained. When Daniel arrived, he looked composed but unsettled, like a man standing at the edge of something he did not want to see clearly. He told her he had asked Emily directly about the timeline. According to him, she had insisted that early ultrasounds were often inaccurate and that stress could affect measurements. She had become tearful, questioning why he would even entertain doubt during what should have been a joyful season. Margaret listened without interruption. She understood that emotion could be persuasive, especially when wrapped in vulnerability. Daniel admitted that her reaction had made him feel guilty for asking questions at all. Margaret reached across the table and gently reminded him that truth does not fear verification. She explained again that a non-invasive test would not harm anyone and could protect their marriage from unspoken suspicion. Daniel sat in silence for several seconds before nodding slowly. He said that if there was nothing to hide, clarity would only strengthen their family. Later that evening, Daniel informed Emily that he wanted to proceed with additional testing for reassurance. The response was not what he expected. Emily did not become furious, but she grew distant. She asked why his mother seemed so involved in their private matters and suggested that Margaret had never truly accepted her. When Daniel relayed this to Margaret over the phone, she felt a quiet tightening in her chest, not from accusation, but from recognition. Deflection was often easier than explanation. Within a week, an appointment was scheduled with a certified laboratory in downtown Chicago. Margaret did not attend. She remained at home, reorganizing old photo albums and pretending her hands were steady. Daniel completed the cheek swab while Emily provided the required blood sample. The technician explained that results would take approximately 1 week. 7 days had never felt so long. During that waiting period, Emily limited contact with Margaret. Family dinners were postponed. Messages went unanswered for hours. Daniel's voice on the phone carried strain he attempted to mask with reassurance. Margaret did not press. She had initiated this path, and now she would allow it to unfold. On the 6th evening, as Margaret watered the small rose bushes along her driveway, Daniel called. His breathing sounded uneven, not panicked, but heavy, like someone preparing to deliver news that could not be reshaped. He asked if he could come over immediately. Margaret looked at the fading Illinois sunset, at the quiet street that had witnessed so many stages of her life. and told him the door would be unlocked. She understood, before he even arrived, that the next conversation would separate assumption from reality once and for all. Daniel stood in Margaret's living room holding a sealed envelope, his shoulders squared in a way that reminded her of the day he had left for college, determined to appear stronger than he felt. He did not sit immediately. He placed the envelope on the coffee table as if it carried weight beyond paper. Margaret gestured calmly toward the sofa, and once he lowered himself into the familiar cushions, she took the chair across from him, maintaining the quiet composure she had practiced her entire adult life. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Finally, Daniel opened the envelope and unfolded the laboratory report with hands that were steady but pale. He read the words once more before looking up at his mother. The results stated clearly that he was excluded as the biological father with a probability of 0%. There was no ambiguous language, no room for interpretation. Margaret did not gasp. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply inhaled slowly and allowed the information to settle into the space between them. Daniel stared at the paper as though repetition might alter its meaning. He said that Emily had promised him there was no possibility of error. He had confronted her before coming over. At first she had denied everything, insisting the laboratory must have made a mistake. When he showed her the official certification and identification numbers on the report, her confidence shifted. She admitted that she had been uncertain about the timing but had hoped the dates would align in their favor. She claimed she had been afraid of losing stability, afraid of disappointing everyone, afraid of facing consequences. Daniel's voice did not rise as he recounted the conversation. It sounded hollow, like a man walking through the remains of something he had trusted. Margaret listened without judgment. She felt sadness, yes, but also a strange clarity. The uncertainty that had shadowed her thoughts for weeks was gone. In its place stood a fact. Daniel asked her what he should do. Margaret chose her response carefully. She told him that betrayal does not become smaller when ignored, and that marriage built on omission cannot remain steady. She reminded him that his worth did not depend on salvaging a narrative that was never true. Outside, the last light of evening faded across the quiet suburban street. Inside, a family foundation had shifted irreversibly. Margaret rose to make tea, not because tea could solve anything, but because steadiness in small gestures sometimes anchors larger storms. As she handed the cup to her son, she understood that the real test ahead would not be about biology. It would be about integrity, and whether Daniel would have the courage to rebuild his life on truth rather than convenience. The morning after the results, Margaret woke before sunrise, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. Discipline had carried her through widowhood, mortgage payments, and years of single motherhood, and it would carry her now. Daniel had stayed late the night before, speaking in measured sentences about confrontation and consequence. By midnight he had returned to the house he shared with Emily, determined to address everything directly. Margaret had not asked for details after that. She believed some conversations must unfold without witnesses. 2 days passed before Daniel called again. His voice sounded older, as though a layer of youth had been quietly removed. He explained that Emily had finally admitted the truth without deflection. She acknowledged that during a brief period of tension in their marriage, she had made a decision she deeply regretted. She had convinced herself the dates might align, and when the pregnancy test was positive, she chose hope over honesty. She believed stability would protect everyone involved. Daniel told Margaret that what hurt him most was not the biology, but the sustained deception. Trust, once fractured, does not return simply because apologies are offered. Margaret listened carefully, offering no condemnation toward Emily, only clarity toward her son. She told him that accountability must precede forgiveness, and that forgiveness without accountability is merely avoidance. Over the next week, Daniel moved into the guest room at Margaret's house temporarily. He insisted it was not permanent, only space to think. Margaret respected that boundary. She did not criticize Emily publicly, nor did she involve extended family. Instead, she met privately with her attorney once more, not to retaliate, but to ensure Daniel understood his legal options and financial protections. She quietly adjusted her estate documents as well, not as punishment, but as prudence. Meanwhile, Emily attempted reconciliation. She sent messages expressing remorse and asking for another chance. emphasizing the stress and fear that had influenced her silence. Daniel read them, but did not respond immediately. Margaret observed him closely during evening dinners at her dining table. He appeared conflicted, balancing memory against reality. One evening, he admitted he still cared about Emily, but no longer recognized the foundation of their marriage. Margaret reminded him that compassion and boundaries can exist together. She did not raise her voice or suggest revenge. Instead, she encouraged him to choose a future built on transparency. Outside, autumn began to settle over Naperville, leaves collecting along quiet sidewalks. Inside Margaret's home, a different season was taking shape. The illusion of certainty had dissolved, replaced by something steadier and more demanding. Margaret understood that the crisis had never truly been about an ultrasound or a report. It had been about character revealed under pressure. And in the quiet strength of her living room, she resolved that whatever direction Daniel chose next, it would not be guided by fear or convenience, but by truth. By mid-October, the air in Naperville carried a sharper chill, and with it came a clarity that Daniel could no longer postpone. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since the test results, and the temporary arrangement at Margaret's house had turned into a quiet routine. Daniel left each morning in a pressed shirt and returned each evening with the weight of unresolved decisions resting visibly on his shoulders. Emily continued reaching out, her messages shifting from apology to urgency. She explained that the child deserved stability regardless of biology and asked Daniel not to allow one mistake to define their entire future. Margaret read none of those messages herself, but she could see the emotional pull in her son's expression. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel asked Margaret if Emily could come over to talk in a neutral setting. Margaret agreed immediately. She believed that resolution, whatever form it took, required composure rather than avoidance. When Emily arrived, she looked exhausted, her confidence replaced by a quiet vulnerability. She acknowledged the deception without excuses this time. She admitted that fear of losing financial security and social stability had influenced her silence. She said she had convinced herself that protecting the image of a family was better than confronting the truth. Margaret listened without interruption, her posture upright, her tone calm. When Emily finished, Margaret spoke carefully. She explained that stability built on omission is fragile and that trust, once compromised, demands more than regret. She made it clear that she would not interfere with whatever decision Daniel made, but she would not support a future grounded in uncertainty. Daniel then spoke with a steadiness Margaret had not heard in weeks. He said he needed a marriage rooted in transparency, not convenience. He informed Emily that he would be filing for divorce, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The room fell quiet. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only the heavy understanding that some consequences cannot be negotiated away. Emily nodded slowly, acknowledging that this outcome was the result of her own choices. After she left, Daniel remained seated at the dining table, staring at the polished wood surface where countless family meals had once symbolized unity. Margaret placed a gentle hand over his and reminded him that endings, though painful, can also protect dignity. In the weeks that followed, legal steps were taken with professionalism and restraint. Margaret adjusted her estate planning formally, ensuring her assets were secured in a trust that prioritized integrity over assumption. She did not speak ill of Emily in the community. She did not seek sympathy. Instead, she maintained the same quiet strength that had defined her entire adult life. As autumn leaves gathered along the curb outside her home, Margaret understood that while the future no longer resembled the image she once imagined, it was at least honest. And for her, honesty was worth more than any illusion of harmony. Winter arrived quietly in Naperville, covering the neighborhood in a thin layer of snow that softened the edges of everything it touched. By December, the legal process was nearly complete. Daniel had moved into a small condominium 15 minutes from Margaret's house, close enough for Sunday dinners, yet far enough to rebuild his independence. The divorce proceedings remained civil, handled through attorneys with measured professionalism. Emily relocated to another suburb to be closer to her own parents. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic scenes. The separation unfolded with the quiet finality of 2 signatures placed on official paper. Margaret observed the transition with steady eyes. She did not celebrate the outcome, but neither did she mourn an illusion. She understood that what had ended was not simply a marriage, but a version of the future she had once imagined. One evening, as snow gathered along her driveway, Daniel joined her for dinner. He looked different now, not broken but recalibrated. There was a maturity in his posture, a seriousness shaped by experience rather than assumption. Over roast chicken and steamed vegetables, he admitted that the hardest part had been accepting that love alone does not guarantee honesty. Margaret listened and then reminded him that character reveals itself when pressure rises, and that this lesson, though painful, had preserved years of potential misunderstanding. She had finalized her estate adjustments the week prior, placing her assets into a structured trust with clear conditions tied to integrity and responsibility. Not as punishment, but as principle. She believed that legacy should reward truth, not convenience. As the evening ended, Daniel helped her wash the dishes, a simple routine that felt grounding. He thanked her, not for interfering, but for insisting on clarity when emotion might have clouded judgment. Margaret smiled gently and told him that motherhood does not end when a child becomes an adult. It evolves into guidance offered with restraint. Later that night, Margaret stood by her living room window, looking out at the quiet street illuminated by soft yellow porch lights. Months earlier, she had walked this same room carrying uncertainty and silent dread. Now she felt something steadier. The crisis that began in a dim ultrasound room had forced uncomfortable questions, but it had also prevented a lifetime built on doubt. Margaret understood that families are not defined by appearances or announcements. They are defined by truth upheld even when it is inconvenient. She turned off the lights and prepared for bed, knowing that while the future had changed shape, it was at least honest. And for Margaret Whitmore, honesty was the foundation upon which any lasting family must stand.